Have you ever wondered if someone can be commitment phobic but also be in a marriage? I know it sounds weird, but the answer is yes, even in very long marriages. So I'm going to be explaining this super confusing dynamic today, and I want to give you some insights into what's actually happening and going on when you're married to someone who it feels like they just don't like you. And sometimes they do and sometimes they don't, and there's a lot of confusion around that. So I want to give you some clarity on that today. But before I dive in, for those of you who are new here, I'm Ketra Thompson, and I'm a certified master hypnotist. I'm also a relationship recovery coach. So what I do is I help my clients go back on a subconscious level and reframe these core beliefs that are driving their unwanted behavior. So it's an incredibly rapid process where people make incredibly large amounts of momentum because we're working on a subconscious level. And then of course, coupling that with all my coaching work helps my clients get the absolute best results. So if you'd like to learn more about that, check out the link in the description below. There's all the information on my website, and you can also set up a completely complimentary consultation call so you and I can chat. It's totally free. Get to the root of what's going on and figure out if this is a good fit for you, if hypnotherapy and working with me is a good fit for you and for me. And so if you'd like to learn more, check that out. I'd also like to mention that if this content resonates with you, please hit like and subscribe so you can be notified every time I post a new video. So, commitment phobia might not even be a word that's on your radar, but it happens a lot, not just in the relationship dating world, but it also happens in marriages. And last week I did a video about how this presents itself more in the dating relationship. But this week I want to talk about marriages because I don't think that people realize that a lot of the behavior that gets labeled narcissistic or toxic, and it may very well be narcissistic and certainly toxic, can also be part of a commitment phobic issue. So most of the time in a marriage, this comes out when some kind of locked in feeling happens. Now, for some people, it's before marriage when the engagement happens or this level of commitment is asked for. But in a marriage, it can happen right after you're married, even like the day after. Sometimes it takes another year or so before things, when things have settled down and all of a sudden the commitment phobic person's like, oh, I feel trapped. And so it can also happen after children are born, because now there's this big commitment to raising this child, and it changes the dynamic of the relationship. Even though, let me mention, a lot of commitment phobic people don't see children as a lifetime commitment. They assume they're going to grow up and they're going to leave, and so they don't act out these behaviors toward their children necessarily, because in their minds, children are not a lifetime commitment, as weird as that might sound. So it primarily happens in the spousal relationship. So even if this person doesn't act this way with anyone else, it's because their spouse is the person that they are forced to be vulnerable with, and the person that causes them the most level of fear about that vulnerability. So it's this point where the commitment phobic person really feels trapped. They feel like they're going to have to be vulnerable with their partner. And so what happens is they start creating a narrative. They start creating a negative narrative because it does a couple things for them. It allows them to believe in their own mind that this other person is bad, isn't right, isn't good, doesn't deserve everything I am. And they start creating a list of negatives about this person, because if they can do that, then they can justify leaving that person at any time and being the victim. So they keep going with this negative narrative. And that's not to say that there aren't true issues that could be called negatives in a relationship, right? But with this person, it's typically things that they knew about you from day one. But now in their mind, they're blowing those things up and making them bigger. They knew you kept your clothes in a basket for 2 days before you ended up putting them away. They knew what your religious preferences were. They knew what your body type was, but they start complaining and fault finding with all of these things, making them bigger than they need to be because it helps justify their ability to feel calm inside because they think I can leave this person because X, Y, and Z. Like, who wouldn't want to leave them over these issues? So not only does it create justification for them leaving, it also creates distance. So when they're fault finding and creating a negative narrative, they create distance between each other. So why would you want to be close with someone who is criticizing you? Why would you want to be close with someone who is picking apart dumb things about you? You wouldn't. And so they get what they want, which is really space and distance. And honestly, they either don't know that this is what's going on in them because that's how they've always been, or they do know and they don't want to say the reality of needing space because they're afraid of the consequences. They don't want to look like the bad guy. And it's a very cowardly sort of move, actually. Let me give you an example of something that happened to me. I was newly married, and my husband at the time was carrying several plastic bins down to a truck. We were 2 days after we had been married. And the whole time in his head, I didn't realize, he was angry at me that I wasn't carrying all this stuff down because I was still getting ready. But I had no idea he was in this process of fault finding to create distance. So when I went out to ask him to not throw something out, my bouquet actually, he turned around and threw it at me, hitting me with it, and the whole thing fell apart. And I remember being in that moment and just thinking, oh my God, what have I done in this marriage? Like, I didn't understand the behavior. It was very sudden and unexpected. And it wasn't the end of that behavior. It was just the beginning. But it was right after we had gotten married. So this kind of behavior of people having this big reaction to now being in this commitment that they've agreed to be in, it's like now they're finally safe to do it and you can't run because they don't want you to leave, but they also don't want you close to them. And it creates a really, really confusing dynamic. And a lot of people go on for years and years and years in these marriages, and it can be very confusing for the partner that's not the commitment phobic partner, right? So they end up experiencing this commitment phobic partner can do a lot of stuff to create distance. They can have lots of things they criticize you about, telling you that when they see you interacting with your friends, maybe afterwards they say, you're such a nerd, you're so dumb when you're with them. Maybe they create a lot of busyness so that they don't have time to spend with you really, unless it's on their terms. So they are not conscious of your schedule or your needs, and they just create a go, go, go mentality with work or play or whatever it is. Sometimes they stonewall, where you speak to them and they don't even answer you back. They don't treat you like you're in the room. They ignore your needs. And they're doing all of this because the idea of being vulnerable and the idea of commitment is so terrifying to them. It's like the second you move toward them for a deeper, more vulnerable connection, like they feel like they're already drowning. And by you asking for more connection, you're offering to tie huge weights around their feet that'll sink them to the bottom. That's how they feel. Some people literally get tightness in their chest or an elevated heart rate, and it's all because of this commitment issue. So it's incredibly confusing. They want closeness, and they also want distance. And so sometimes they behave kindly to get that closeness, but then quickly revert back to creating distance. And it's a very confusing dynamic, but they can stay in it forever. Sometimes people never get divorced out of those situations. Even though they're commitment phobic, even though they don't want to let their partner in, they also don't want to be alone. So this happens because of a few things that are going on. So they're actually severely insecure people, and they don't want people to see their imperfections or their weaknesses. And if they're vulnerable with their partner, then their partner is going to see those things about them. Someone's going to see the reality, and they're going to have to drop their mask to some degree. They probably have childhood neglect or abandonment issues. Their needs weren't met in childhood. They lost a parent due to death or illness or even just absence from busyness. So there's all of these things that are sort of driving their behavior, and they're things that have probably been a part of them forever. So if you're in a marriage with someone like this, it's not likely you, but there still are some things about you that might be allowing this to continue. So if you're someone staying in a relationship with someone like that, it's one thing to find yourself suddenly in this relationship and to realize right away, this is not right. This is wrong. And it might take you a while to figure out the confusing aspects of it. You might end up trauma bonded, but at some point you realize without too terribly long of a commitment that you have to get out of this because it's certainly not healthy. And then there's others that end up staying in it for decades. And the problem is there's a part of you that is probably also a little commitment phobic. So don't turn this off and freak out right now. The truth is that you chose someone who is commitment phobic, but you might also be a little passively commitment phobic, because in the same way you can justify what you're feeling about this negativity toward them because they're doing all of these awful things, but you're still not choosing to leave. So you're still not choosing to have this sense of worth for yourself. And that's actually the commonality between both parties, is that this sense of worth doesn't exist in a healthy way for either partner usually, because if our worth is intact, then we don't feel like we have to keep up a mask. So these people who don't want to be vulnerable and don't want to let you see their imperfections, they're very harsh on themselves, very big inner critic, and consequently, they're very critical of everyone else around them. And so there's not this centeredness of them. Like they're not centered in their self-worth, so that they don't feel like other people's opinions and assumptions of them, they're not thinking, oh, that's just them. That's their view, their lens. And instead, they let that define them. And so they're very careful who sees things about them because other people's opinions define them. And it might be that way with you as well. If you're in a marriage with someone who's actively like this, there might be part of you that defines your view of yourself by what other people think of you and their opinions and their assumptions. And so instead of being centered in your own self-worth, you're constantly defining yourself by someone else's behaviors. And this keeps you stuck. So once you heal that part of you that has had the complex trauma as a child, that has been abandoned and neglected and whose needs haven't been met and who's afraid of that commitment, that's when you can start having that deep level of self-worth that allows you to make proactive decisions about your life, allows you to make choices to leave a marriage like that and to change the way that you interact in your relationships. And I do that work with my clients through customized hypnotherapy processes. We get to the root cause of what's going on, because the truth is your subconscious mind is running over 95% of everything you think, feel, and do. And you don't typically have access to it unless you're in hypnosis. So hypnosis allows you this ability to really change the operating system, change and reframe what you used to believe with the truth about who you are. So you can live a life that's centered and that you know who you are and you have self-worth and you have addressed some of those issues so that you don't keep perpetuating this cycle. Because you can stay with this other person hoping that you're going to complain enough that they're going to finally realize you're amazing and stop pushing you away, but that's not reality. Or you can leave and you can value yourself. And the thing is that sometimes these relationships go on because they are mutually dysfunctional in different ways, with different levels of responsibility in that dysfunction, but sometimes they're mutually dysfunctional. So the work has to start with you. You can't change your partner, but you can start tuning into what's going on inside of you and zooming back, looking at the big picture of what's going on. Because their behavior to act so cold one minute and so loving another, like that's not on you, but you staying in it can be the issue. And I don't say that flippantly or judgmentally because I know how hard it is to get out of it. I know what a trauma bond does to your brain. I know the cognitive dissonance that it creates. I know about the financial struggles of this kind of shift. I'm aware of it. But at some point, we all have to take responsibility for the life that we're creating and decide what the next smallest step is to take to create a change in our life. A real change that actually gives us the results of what we want. We can say what we want, we can declare what we want, but if we aren't getting it, if we aren't living it, then maybe that's not what we want. And if it is what we want, we have to make a decision to take some steps that are different. So again, today I would ask that you be a little self-reflective about what's going on inside of you and what you really want and what that next smallest step is. And if you'd like to set up that consultation call, that link is below in the description. You can set that up for free and we can talk about this and get you some clarity about your situation and see if we're a good fit to work together. So until next time, I hope you curate a life by your own design.